Okay, so we are going to begin the first panel, and then there will be a short coffee break after that. So we really are blessed today. It's an embarrassment of riches in terms of the caliber and the range of speakers and panelists that we have today, and I think it speaks to just how important this subject is. We're very, very fortunate to have this first panel on the subject of liberal democracy in decline around the world. So I'm going to just introduce our four panelists, and then they will be off to the races. So Sabine Sparwasser, retired in 2024 as Germany's ambassador to Canada. She has since become Dean of the Mercator Leadership College. She continues to work occasionally for the German Foreign Office as Special Envoy. And in the 40 years of her career in the German Foreign Office, she served in Brussels, the EU, London, Costa Rica, Ottawa, and Toronto. She was deputy spokesperson for the Foreign Office and head of the Middle East Division. She has led recruitment and training in the Foreign Service Academy and was political director for the Southern Hemisphere. She's going to share some of her observations and reflections on the state of democracy from her unique vantage point as a diplomat. Michael Bonner, sitting next to her, a veteran of Canadian federal and provincial politics and a historian of ancient Iran. But saying this is to do Michael a great injustice. He is genuinely a Renaissance man who has reflected deeply and written about some of the great questions of the ages, not just of his own age. He's published several monographs and articles on Iranian history, but perhaps the work that has managed to transcend any one discipline and to gain notice and to influence our understanding not only of society, but of the nature of civil society and indeed of human nature itself, is his most recent book, In Defense of Civilization: How Our Past Can Renew Our Present. The title of his remarks today is going to be the theological origin of liberalism. Lukan Ahmadway, one of the world's leading thinkers and scholars on politics, democracy, and authoritarianism. He's the distinguished professor of democracy in the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto and fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. His research focuses on global patterns of democracy and dictatorship. His most recent book with Stephen Levitsky is Revolution and Dictatorship: The Violent Origins of Durable Authoritarianism. He also wrote Pluralism by Default: Weak Autocrats and the Rise of Competitive Politics. And his first book, also with Stephen Levitsky, was called Competitive Authoritarianism, about which you're going to hear something today: Hybrid Regimes After the Cold War. Sanjay Ruparelia, one of the most brilliant democracy scholars that we have, is an associate professor of politics at Toronto Metropolitan University, where he holds the Jaroslawski Democracy Chair. He's a senior fellow of the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. His books include Divided We Govern: Coalition Politics in Modern India, The Indian Ideology, and Understanding India's New Political Economy. He also co-hosts On the Front Lines of Democracy, one of the most outstanding and widely followed podcasts that I have not yet been invited to be a guest on, and a lecture series, and he contributes to the media in North America and Asia. All right, so with those introductions, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then they may choose to engage with each other, and then we will be open for questions. So let's begin with Sabine.
Thank you so much,
And
Peter.
do you want to speak from there, or do you want the podium, whatever you prefer?
Actually, I prefer the podium. Might
Okay,
be a little
perfect.
easier with the microphone.
Yep.
Thank you so much, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be at Massey College. Congratulations to the new principal. Peter, I'm still sort of digesting a talk that I think has been absolutely startling, very insightful, And I would now and immediately ask, can I have that in writing? Because it is something that needs to be read and reread. It is a startling and dark but totally realistic analysis. So I am actually more than a little apprehensive to be here with scholars of this kind of quality, Sanjay, Lucan, and Michael, because I'm a practitioner. I've been in the Foreign Service for 40 years, and I've lived through the high time of liberal democracy, and I'm seeing the decline, and I've seen it in action in my job. I will talk more about Europe, obviously, in my talk. But, I mean, obviously, you can't ignore what Peter has now so vividly described, the decline and the demise of liberal democracy by the US stepping out of its role. It was, after all, the United States who in the late 18th century has given us this model of liberal democracy that the founding fathers created and that established the liberal West and the order system that we enjoyed for so many years, and that came to its peak at the end of the 20th century, in 1989, actually, for me as a German, in this moment of the fall of the wall, that was the big victory of our system, of the West, of our liberal democratic system. Now, when did it become obvious to me as a practitioner that liberal democracy as the order system is unraveling? It was in 2001, and it was actually at a conference in Durban that I went to with my foreign minister at the time. This was a conference, a UN conference against racism. And we could see the world fall apart over the definition, is Zionism racism, is over the definition of anti-Semitism. It is a conference that failed, and a conference that showed the split in the world, and that our sort of definitions of what racism is, of what liberal democracy is, was actually shaken. That conference is more or less forgotten because a few days later, 9/11 happened. And that was the startling moment where I think what I had lived as a diplomat, sort of things were gradually getting better all the time. Liberal democracy was winning, and with the fall of the Berlin Wall, we had thought we had the recipe in which to make the world a better place. All of that was falling apart, and 2001 was, for me, very physically the moment where I thought, ooh, it's not getting better all the time. The next point, a point where maybe we Europeans didn't pay attention enough, was 2014. 2014, when Russia attacked Crimea and Ukraine, began to attack Ukraine, where it became clear that not everybody accepts our philosophy of negotiation, consensus, win-win, and suddenly might creates right is again what is happening in Europe in particular. The rules-based order was broken in favor of a power-based order by Russia, and we, the West, were relatively slow to react to it. We did react to it. We armed Ukraine. We helped Ukraine defend itself better, which is why it was later able to actually withstand the Russian onslaught. But we probably did not act fast enough and hard enough. And the next point, and this is the point Peter so vividly described, 2025, the US abdication of leading the liberal world, the US abdication of being a liberal democracy, And the crucial moment for me, the envisioning of that, was the moment that keeps replaying in my mind, Zelensky in the Oval Office. I think that's going to be the iconic moment where we know this was over. So why did it unravel? Why did liberal democracy unravel? Why did the West, the liberal West, unravel? Well, there are many, many reasons, and I suspect we're going to talk about many of them in much more depth. But certainly, the liberal order did not benefit all. There's great parts of the world who did not. We also thought, we, the West, thought that if we exported our trade, our wealth, we could also export our values and people would buy into it. And latest by the success of China as a wealthier nation, but a nation that does not buy into our values and does not buy into democratic values, definitely. And where we see that it has the wealth that has been exported and has been created by China has served to strengthen the one-party system. Latest at that moment, we needed to understand that it wasn't trade that was going to change it. We also were arrogant. The West was very arrogant, and we thought we knew everything best and we could tell everybody and didn't listen to people's cultures, to people's sensitivities. We also had double standards, and I do remember when I was press spokesperson for the Foreign Office in 2002, I walked into the public press conference, which is held 3 times a week, with a very small stomach, because I always feared somebody would ask me about Guantanamo. How do you explain our high-minded human rights values and explain Guantanamo? I was never asked that question. I don't know why. Anyway, I want to add another point why liberal democracies failed. And it's, I think, also because they were built on a different speed of decision-making. We relied, for liberal democracies, we relied on rational and slow decision-making. If you want, we were still relying on a Gutenberg speed. You could read things, you could ponder them, you trusted in experts who knew more about it, and we let them represent and do the rational decision-making and had trust. With the arrival of the internet, with the instant expertise that everybody can have at all times, and the need for politics to react in real time, that has been taken away. And I think there's a big reason why why liberal democracy is under so much pressure. It's also under real and obvious attack. Authoritarians all over the world see liberal democracy as a threat to their own power, Russia. Their systems are very often, or always, based on repression of individuals, but also kleptocracies. They're based on corruption. And we see this. I mean, just the question of the last few days that has been raised has who has benefited of the turmoil in the markets, and has a president actually had a hand in telling his people when to buy and when to sell? That is an obvious sign of this kind of thing. Anyway, under threat from outside and from inside the West. We have in the EU, we have Orban, who has been writing the playbook on how to change from a democracy, a liberal democracy, into what he calls an illiberal nationalist regime. We see now Austria with Kickl, who wants to change things. We see obviously the Trump government, I don't know if you followed how Vice President Vance in Germany went to Munich and gave that speech in which he accused Germany and other states of being illiberal because we condemn hate speech. These people all want to reform. They pretend to want to reform democracy by abolishing it. And Peter has described in detail how they go about. But one thing they go after is separation of powers, and then take the judiciary, influence the media, get into all the mechanisms of control. But one thing that I find the most startling that we're seeing right now at the moment is what in German they call Gleichschaltung, synchronization of all the institution, and that includes words you can use, books you can read, universities, what they can teach, and you know, all of that leads, and as a German, you know that, it leads into book burning, it leads into physical attacks. So very dangerous element that we see in action now. And we have danger looming in other countries. In Europe, we have in France a very strong Le Pen movement. We have in Britain, Farage is doing relatively well. And in Germany, my country, it breaks your heart to see that in a country that, has said never again. We have 24% now polling for the AfD, which is an extremist, right-wing extremist, xenophobic, and in many elements, fascist party. So we're in a, I would say, do or die moment. And we are, I think, we heard the shot, we heard the call. Europe needs to shoulder now the responsibility to lead the West and to defend liberal democracy. It needs to be Europe, and when I say Europe, I definitely include countries like Norway. I include Britain. It's not the EU, it's Europe. And actually, I include, if it wants, Canada. And our aim must be to deter the US from doing mutual harms. And the EU has been really good. Ursula von der Leyen has led a very strong response, very cold-blooded, very targeted on where it can hurt. But I really I recommend the way the EU has been dealing with the threat of tariff and is holding onto things they can do and showing that they have a hold on certain choke points, including on the tech companies, the US tech companies. Second point, what we need to do is to deter Russia from attacking even more countries, from further attacking, and that means we have to help Ukraine hold the line and defend itself as good as it can. And I'm glad to say that the future chancellor, in all likelihood, of Germany has already said he will deliver Taurus to Ukraine. We have to take, as Europeans, and that includes Canada, leadership in NATO. We have to find strength in numbers, the coalitions of the willing, and I would say I would look to Japan, I would look to South Korea, I would look to bigger trading corporations like the EU working with the CPTPP. So find strength in numbers, but very, very significantly, we have to toughen up. We have to actually arm ourselves. We have to spend an awful lot more money on the military. We will have to reinforce military service, and we're stepping there. Sweden and other nations, Finland, have already done it. We in Germany will have to do it too. It'll be very difficult for a nation that has a very pacifistic DNA in many ways. But I think we need to do it. We need, as Europeans, bring together coalitions of the willing within the EU. That means build consensus around those who won't go along. I'm talking Hungary, for example. So we can work together with the British and others and try and find a common security policy with them. There's already been very promising talks started. I'll be short now. This is, in medicine, what you call a crisis is the peak. I do hope that we are at the peak of a very, very difficult development in politics. And at the peak, you decide if it's death or if it's recovery. And I think for liberal democracy, we're at that point where we have to do it. There are some good news. I think we have growing clarity amongst our leaders. We have, in Germany, if I may talk about my country for a second now, even before the formation of the government, a very important decision taken on investing $1 trillion, if you take it all together, into infrastructure, into military, into defending ourselves, and into helping to be a leader and a force in, within Europe. So that decision has been taken before the government is even in place. We need to reform the way our countries deliver services. We need to show our citizens our country's work, and there are plenty of good ideas around. We see growing popular engagement also in the US, but here in Canada too. And I look at Turkey too, and I see that the population is understanding that it needs to defend their countries. And I would echo what Peter said in his closing remarks. Democracy lives of participation. Who participates in anything, from school boards to political parties, receives an education in compromise and an education in being together. And I think this is what we need to do. We need to ask our citizens to toughen up, but also to participate far, far more for our liberal democracy. Thank you.
I assume this one is on. Can everyone hear me? Right. I heard the words toughen up. I heard participate. And I agree 100%. I'm not going to say anything that could be taken otherwise. But I want to look at what I think is a much deeper problem. And I want to get to the root of it. Now, long ago, I'm not actually very good at mathematics or physics, but long ago I had a physics teacher, and he said, he was trying to explain at a very basic level relativity. And he always said, if I'm not confusing you, I'm not doing my job. So I hope that I don't intend to confuse you, but what I'm going to say is probably going to sound odd. And if it doesn't sound odd, if it doesn't sound weird, I'm probably not being clear. So there's a little definition here of what liberalism is. My favorite definition comes from Judith Shklar, and it's very basic, just securing the political conditions for personal freedom, basically. It is a doctrine, and I use the word doctrine advisedly, a doctrine of freedom. But I'm going to put a question to you next. I'm going to warn you, I'm going to end with a question. And I have an answer to the first question. I have many answers to the first question, but I have no answer to the final question. And so get ready. Now, these are 4 key texts, if you can see them, that we would associate with liberalism, with a sort of Western doctrine of freedom. The last one, the last one is close to home. The last one is from the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The first one, we hold these truths to be self-evident. I think that's obvious. But this is the only one, the first one, is the only one that says that something is self-evident, right? That this notion that there are unalienable rights, that there are certain freedoms, there are certain things that pertain to humanity naturally. The second quotation is from the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. Note that word natural, and two words, natural and imprescriptible rights, one of which is liberty, the others are property, security, resistance to oppression, and so forth. Dignity, equality. Now, the question is, how do we know that we are right when we say that these things are true? In some sense, Thomas Jefferson was the most honest when he asserted, in his view, that these ideas were self-evident. Right? Now, we have just heard some evidence, and we will probably hear more evidence today, that in fact, these things are not self-evident. The claims are not self-evident. They are not obvious, because if they were, I think we would be living in a very different world. They are not self-evident. They come from a very specific place, from a set of ideas, from a set of assumptions, and I put it to you today that they are all, in origin, theological. They come from Western Christianity. They come from assumptions, first and foremost, about the nature of God, and secondarily about the nature of man. Now, you may have seen books by people like Fukuyama or John Gray, where they talk about, they talk about four main ideas of liberalism, four main qualities. I think there are actually five, and I call them axioms. So we have this notion of human equality. We have a very heavy emphasis on free will. We have, sorry, I have to read my own thing here, make sure I get the order right. Moral autonomy of individuals is another one. And then there are two more that I don't think get the emphasis they tend to deserve. One is an original and primordial distinction between a world of religion and a world that you would call secular, or the world and the church, or however you wish to describe that dichotomy. And last, that there is a kind of process to history. There's a kind of, we call it progress, or it was in former ages, it was called progress. There's a sort of teleological development toward some future state. Okay? Liberalism, I argue, it assumes that all of these things are true, but the problem for liberalism is that it cannot prove them. Okay? It has inherited these ideas. Now, if you, where are we here? Yes, sorry, my slides are in a funny order. I'm not the first person to have pointed this out. Many have drawn attention to it. It even has a name, the Buckenforde dilemma. Some people call it the Buckenforde paradox. But the basic idea is that liberalism reposes upon a series of assumptions that it cannot prove. It assumes them to be true. Now, why do I say they are theological? Because they come ultimately from assumptions about the nature of God. If you believe that God created the world, the universe, human beings, everything in it, and you also believe that human beings are made in the image and likeness of God and so forth, as is asserted in Genesis, you get a number of other theological principles about human beings also. God being omnipotent and omniscient and so forth, he has an irresistible and absolutely free will. He can do what he likes, and therefore the human will must reflect that somehow. If God acts in history, then there's some kind of process to it and so forth. These are all very old ideas that go back to obviously to the Old Testament, elaboration in the New Testament, and then in the West, elaboration through what we call the scholastic movement and onwards up to the present day. Forgive my silly-looking collage here, but you will find reflections of these ideas in practically any sort of post-medieval thinker. Also, there's some version of it everywhere. John Locke is up there in the corner. Many scholars have referred to Locke's ideas as being a kind of political theology, and I think that that's fundamentally true. And you find elaborations of it that become less and less overtly theological as we go forward. And I think this is the key, that these assumptions that originally came from religion become so deeply ingrained over time that they are taken for granted. And as they get taken for granted, forgive my silly meme from Fukuyama, as they get taken for granted, they come to lose the justification that they once had within either scholasticism or in the world of belief and so forth. And even our friend Francis Fukuyama here, whom I respect greatly, he is writing something that could be considered almost in the same category as prophecy. He's almost like a modern Joachim of Fiore, predicting this sort of coming third age of the world. Of course, that was something of a misinterpretation, but it was still widely believed that that was the case. And you'll see this meme occurring on Twitter or Facebook a lot now. So perhaps it's not as funny as I thought it would be, but it's now alarmingly common. Another thing is a bit of a paradox. As the sort of quasi-religious assumptions fall away or get ingrained and or taken for granted, there are some strains of liberalism that take on, like the Fukuyama prophecy, they take on almost a religious twinge or a religious tone of their own. The sort of, we have Milton Friedman here and Ludwig von Mises. They're essentially, I call them, they're almost like televangelists about the market. And there is, especially in von Mises, if you replace the word, if you take out the word market in almost everything he writes and you replace it with the word God, it's really quite astounding. It sounds like, it sounds like the work of a convert to a new mystery religion. But my point there is that there is still this sort of vestige of a theological motive, and it's almost as though when the original theology is removed, it's almost as though we want to put in a new one. And you can also think of things like the cult of the supreme being in the same terms, or the religion of nature that came out of the Enlightenment and so forth. But this could be the subject of another talk all on its own. So I won't get too deeply into it, but also consider the work of John Rawls. I think this is probably a well-known name. Rawls himself was once a theologian. He eventually became an atheist. But consider this is the last paragraph of his most famous work. And if you consider the very last sentence, I don't know if you can see it, but I'll read it to you. He says, "Purity of heart, if one could attain it, would be to see clearly and to act with grace and self-command from this point of view." This is a work on political liberalism called A Theory of Justice. Now, if you take these words out of context, you may find yourself asking, what does purity of heart mean? Why does he assume that this must be an obvious thing that he doesn't need to define? What does it mean to see clearly? What does it mean to act with grace? There is still a vestige of these theological assumptions lurking even within the work of atheists. I've already mentioned the book and them. Now, I want to give you some counter examples just to drive a point home. These are little excerpts from religious texts of three great world religions. One is Hinduism from the Upanishads, one is Islam from the Quran, and the last is Zoroastrianism. These are three passages which are considered within their own context to be of the utmost importance, the supreme expressions of their respective religions. You've probably heard this phrase, that thou art, or Tattvam Asi. I think certain hippies repeated it at some point, but this is of fundamental importance within the Upanishads and so forth. What we have done in the West is that we have done the equivalent of building ideas and phrases such as this into a political philosophy or into a political doctrine. To those who don't already believe, I suggest that the ideas don't actually have much meaning. They are not self-evident, they need to be explained, they need to be articulated, and we cannot take them for granted. We cannot take liberal ideas for granted. I mean, we can for ourselves, but not in the context of the whole world. Any more than we could look at other theological or religious ideas and assume that they are also universal. And this is a shameless plug for my upcoming book, but this raises, I think, really a very fundamental question, which is that if we cannot believe in the principles and the assumptions of liberalism because of even a kind of vestigial Christian theology, what will their foundation be? What will we believe in? If those assumptions are lost, if the theology is no longer considered sensible or obvious, what will the foundation be? And this is the question that I warned you about, that I don't have an answer for. But it is very much worth contemplating because, to go back to the beginning, this theory of self-evident truths, the theory of an inevitable, the famous misinterpretation of Fukuyama, the theory of an inevitable spread has clearly not come to pass. So again, the question is, what will make us believe? And that's where I end.
The answer to that question is basic intuition. The Kantian tradition, which is represented by Rawls, ultimately is one that, notwithstanding the vestigial theological language, I think is one that is entirely independent of any religious conviction at all. That's why Kant, critique of reason is founded on this notion that it begins with basic intuition. There is a way of saying that there is a basis for this that is not in any way identified with or contingent on the belief in God. And you've got an entire tradition which is different from the Lockean tradition, which I agree, does have this theological sort of dimension to it, the Protestant dimension. But I think we hold these truths to be self-evident. There's one of these moments when Jefferson is saying, well, yes, we do have a tradition that goes back, to Protestant understanding of liberalism, but there is something essential that doesn't depend on the existence of God. And there's a whole argument in the German tradition that is completely separate from this. But we'll talk about that later. Look away.
Okay, so when I've been invited to these conferences the last number of years, I've always been the resident optimist, right? That's my job. That's why my wife married me. I'm a glass half full kind of guy. And indeed, while there's been this sort of aura of pessimism and doom and gloom, if you actually look at, by real things like the rise of China, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, in 2014, and the like, if you actually look at the raw data on the number of democracies in the world until 2024, I think still today, it's about as high as it's ever been. So despite all of this, despite the end of the sort of global liberal hegemony, democracy has survived in most countries, or some form of it. Real, and that's supported by the data. Furthermore, in my home country, I'm sorry, I'm American, can't help it. Social science, based on data, has shown that no democracy as old or as rich as the United States has ever, broken down. So when journalists ask me, what are other cases? Well, there are no other cases, and like the United States. Daniel Treisman reflected, I think, he's a professor at UCLA, with the kind of standard wisdom that basically the chances of a country, of a democracy as old and rich as the United States breaking down was 1 in 333 chances. That's basically zero, right? Furthermore, if you take out, petrostates, fully 95% of high-income countries in the world in 2024 were democracies. In social science, which is a messy world, that's basically all the cases. Can anybody guess who the two exceptions are? Hungary and Singapore. Did I get it? I should have given you a chance to guess. I'm sorry. Okay. But then here we are. The United States today, is April 15th, 2025, is what I call a competitive authoritarian regime. Now, this is a term that Stephen Levitsky and I came up with about 20 years ago. And there's a cases in which, there are real elections. Elections are competitive, and opposition's allowed to run. It's openly, but in which there's all sorts of authoritarian abuse, attacks on media, auditing of opposition leaders, and the like. And in this sense, I think the United States has already become a competitive authoritarian regime. How do we know? For the simple reason that in a democracy, there's virtually no cost for opposing the government. You can publish editorials, you can contribute to the party of your choice, and you can still not have fear of being audited, not have fear of being investigated. And if you're a business person, you can still sort of make a good living, get a good chance of getting a government contract and the like. But we're now in a position where opposition is costly in a way that I think it has not been ever in sort of modern American history. And of course, I'm fully aware that U.S. democracy has had, it is in one sense the world's oldest democracy, but it of course has had enormous problems, above all segregation, Jim Crow and the like. But for the most part, Nixon and for the most part, there have been attacks on opposition have been on those at the margins of the political establishment. Civil rights activists, IWW, the Red Scare at the turn of the century, campus radicals in the 60s. What's going on now also attacks those groups, but is much more sweeping and then touches on the core of the political establishment that we just have not seen. You do not see under Nixon. This is a qualitative difference, right? It's not just they're attacking campus radicals, but they're attacking higher education as such. This is insane. It's not just that they're attacking civil rights activists, but they're attacking major law firms for the sole sin of representing one of the two major parties, the Democratic Party, right? There are congressional probes beginning into Act Blue, which is the major sort of network of Democratic donors. Media is suffering suits in a way that it has never before from the president. The Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, is being used as a vehicle to target anti-Trump media. This has had enormous impact already, just a few months into Trump's term. It's had a chilling effect on donations to the Democratic Party or left-wing causes. NGOs who are sort of really needed right now to defend democracy, they're having to cut staff. I mean, can you believe that? They're having to cut staff now. Certain members of the Democratic, big D Democratic establishment are having trouble finding legal representation because the big law firms are fearful of retribution. Big networks like ABC are settling basically for ridiculous lawsuits and the like. So we're truly unambiguously now in a period of authoritarianism in the United States. So this has already been a pretty pessimistic conference. So I feel like, that's, you're going to be like, whatever, what have you told me that I haven't heard already, Lucan, right? But I want to emphasize something that I've learned, because I've studied a lot of these regimes. And this is something I get, from journalists. And they say, well, at what point does the window close, and I'm like, the window never closes. It is almost always reversible. And if you look at, competitive authoritarian regimes, it is very common, and this is actually what I expect. I think that, in a rearview mirror is a bit pessimistic, but, that you see fluctuation, right? Countries go in and out of authoritarianism. This is very normal, right? And furthermore, it is worth emphasizing that the United States has a vast, well-resourced society. Yes, there is inequality, but but the sheer number, the hundreds of billionaires, 1,700 private universities, a vast infrastructure of churches, NGOs, a very well-funded, motivated, and quite unified big D Democratic Party, opposition party. A vast middle class. It is very hard for anybody, but especially someone as incompetent as Trump, to actually monopolize control over this. So I think it's worthwhile not, somehow feeling that defeatist. At the same time, it is shocking. What's interesting, what you have right now, I think, is a situation in which the powerful are the ones who are caving, who are capitulating. You see on April 5th, there was mass. The normal folks, they're just angry, as they should be, right? They're out there protesting. You had, hundreds of thousands earlier this month. In Los Angeles, you had 36,000. In Utah, the most conservative state in the United States, 20,000, right? So I just want to say that, that I think while this is shocking and cause for pessimism, it is still the first inning, guys. Right? This notion of sort of fatalism is completely misplaced. And we already see, the beginnings of efforts to sort of resist. Thank God, Harvard finally, has, stood up, and partly because Trump's demands were just like, you have, I was sort of thankful. Has anybody read Trump's demands of Harvard University? You should read them. They are insane. And I'm actually quite thankful because, they're basically calling for direct intervention of the federal government into the content of education in a major private university. This is completely unprecedented. It would make, Nixon, who didn't particularly like elite universities, turn over in his grave, right? And so basically it made it impossible for Harvard to capitulate, and I think they're now beginning to wake up and do that. And furthermore, finally, sort of note of optimism has to do with tariffs. Now, tariffs are awful, and it's easier for me to say because I'm not about to retire, so I don't have to worry about that. But the democracy analyst part of me says, thank God, right? Because this guy, it is much harder to consolidate authoritarianism when you have popularity that's in the mid 40s. If he had popularity in the kind of high 80s, it's very easy. But in the 40s, and it's just objectively quite hard. So in South Korea, there was an attempted martial law, President Yoon. Part of the reason why it failed is his popularity was in the single digits. And why does this matter? Because other people are just less likely to go along because they think they're going to fail. It's not that they're moral. It's that I remember when I was in Ukraine during a stolen election in 2004, and the local official had been told to sort of stuff the ballot, and we got drunk later, and I said, well, why didn't you stuff the ballot? And he said, I would have, but I thought he would fail, and then I would be the worst of both worlds, which is that you both do the bad thing and you get punished for it. And so that's why actually popularity is so important, because people are like looking at this. So I think, anyway, so I'll end there on a note of optimism.
So I've read Lucan for many years. I've only met him once before, and I already know it's very hard to follow Lucan. So thank you to Peter for inviting me and for putting together this conference. Can't hear. I always speak too low. Can you hear me now? Thanks to Peter for putting together this conference. What's this one? Okay. Didn't know which mic to speak into. Okay, great. So try again. Thanks to Peter for putting together this conference, inviting me to join. I see the clock here has 11 minutes, 35 seconds. I made the mistake of giving a very grand title, Democratic Backsliding in the Global South. That's a rather big space. But what I'm going to do is give you 3 snapshots of 3 critical countries in the Global South. And I think the headline is similar to what Lucan was saying. I think that, we've seen remarkable backsliding in all 3 countries, but we've also seen regeneration and reversion. And I think that's what I want to kind of say as a headline. And 2 prefatory remarks about backsliding. It's a term political scientists use. It's now become quite popular. And I think about it in sort of 2 different ways, 2 different set of analytical distinctions that might be helpful. So the first is, when you think of backsliding, we think of the actors that are causing it, the backsliders, right? Often democratic elected leaders who act in autocratic ways. But I think there's a second way in which we use it, and sometimes they get conflated. I think it's important to keep it separate, that there's an erosion in the norms, institutions, and practices that we associate with good democratic governance. And I make that distinction because I think there's some things that are affecting our democracies in different parts of the world that have to do with not necessarily any particular actor trying to dismantle it, but because they're weathering different kinds of storms. And I'll talk a little bit about that. The second is, and I think Lucan gets into this, a lot of it, certainly in his work, which is pathbreaking, is this debate that happens, which is backsliding occurring? And I read it 2 different ways, and maybe he reads it differently. One is, backsliding is a real issue, and it's really concerning if it leads to breakdown. Breakdown meaning regime change of some type. And so are we heading towards that is one part of the debate. The second, though, might be that you have backsliding that doesn't lead to regime change, but it's a different kind of democracy we're living in. So we're in a liberal democracy, as Peter said, where we have more autocratic or the populist democracy. There's a new equilibrium, there's a new political order. But it erodes and it affects and it threatens many of the practices and norms we value. But we don't have an authoritarian or an autocratic regime yet. So we're in this sort of liminal space. And I think that second way of thinking about it is what's informed a lot of my work. And that's important because I think, as Lucan was saying, on an optimistic note, there's always a chance of fighting back, of regeneration, of reversals of various kinds. So let me now give you 3 minutes each on India, South Africa, and if I have time, Brazil. So India is probably one of the most startling cases in the world, as you know, of democratic backsliding in the last decade. It's one of the great revolutions in the history of democracy, unprecedented, 1947. No country had ever granted adult universal suffrage in those historical conditions. 20 years before, the United States and Canada, adult full suffrage for a population that was largely literate and destitute. It was a remarkable movement. And what we've seen in the last 10 years under the BJP and Mr. Modi is a classic case of executive aggrandizement, right? The executive office of the state, the Prime Minister's office, has concentrated power, has centralized power. the New Delhi vis-a-vis the states, and has also personalized power. We see a cult of personality, which is quite remarkable. Lucan talked about popularity. Mr. Modi is one of the most popular leaders in the world, despite many setbacks in terms of governance during his 10 years, 70, 80, 85% popularity until this 24 election. So that's what I want to get to. So we've seen this regime backslide. Freedom House downgraded it to partly free. VDEM says it's an electoral autocracy, caused a fierce backlash from the Indian government. But we have seen this sort of overreach of the executive vis-a-vis parliament, vis-a-vis the judiciary. India has one of the most powerful Supreme Courts in the world. Civil society, independent public institutions, and opposition parties generally. They were no longer seen as rivals or adversaries, but as enemies to be destroyed. This is, again, very much part of this autocratic turn. And so in 2024, India had its election, general election, over 7 weeks, 44 days, always the largest election in the world until China becomes a democracy. Almost 1 billion people, part of the electorate. 66% voted. It was, by most accounts, the most unfree election in the history of India, for reasons I can get into in discussion if you're interested. It was also one of the most communal. The Prime Minister himself was making all kinds of appeals to Hindu sentiment, saying you should be threatened by Muslims in particular and minorities generally, which violated the code of conduct. The Election Commission did not censure him as it should have. The polls expected the BJP to win 400 out of 543 seats. And the BJP boasted about it. Almost every poll indicated it would win a vast majority. And that was crucial because 400 seats give you 2/3 majority, which allows you to change the constitution. And many citizens were worried that the secular constitution would become a Hindu constitution. So what happened? The BJP lost 60 seats. It's a hung parliament again. India's had the longest history of hung parliaments of any democracy. I believe 25, that was my first project, as Peter mentioned, Divided We Govern. In a first past the post Westminster parliamentary system, 25 years of coalition governments. It has now had another coalition government, and there was this massive setback. The BJP still won 37% of the vote nationally. It lost in its heartlands, it made inroads elsewhere, but it now had to have a coalition government, and since then, what we've seen is that it's much more constrained. Opposition parties and parties within the coalition, called the NDA, are suddenly asserting themselves. The Supreme Court, which had really lost its way in the last 5-6 years, again, into reasons I can get into in discussion, started to find its voice again. The media, which had really been under attack, and in some cases has sort of become craven, many aspects of the media, suddenly found their voice again. So elections really matter. It's happened 3 times in Indian history, and this was the third, 1977 after the emergency, 2004 after the Vajpayee regime, and this one. So elections really, really matter. And so many would describe India today as a competitive authoritarian regime, to borrow Lucan's phrase, but I wrestle with it because this is a kind of thing that can happen. Why did it happen? The voters punished Mr. Modi and the BJP for hubris, saying they're going to win 400 seats out of 543. That really riled people. Inflation, cost of living, unemployment, socioeconomic concerns that have bedeviled every country, every incumbent in 2024 played a role. And constitutional anxiety. I think we're talking about liberal democracy in the constitution. Many voters, particularly Dalits, and particularly Dalits in northern India, were concerned that if the BJP could change the constitution, it would rob minorities of their rights. It would also strip Dalits of reservations, basically collective job quotas in public service and in higher education. So there was a rallying around the constitution on the trail, the campaign trail. People were talking about the constitution. In rallies in the years up to the election, people were reading the preamble to the Constitution. They were reclaiming the flag as a flag of India. And the opposition parties came together in a coalition, and actually it was a very clunky acronym. Not the acronym wasn't clunky, it was called India, but the actual term of the opposition. They were trying to reclaim this spirit. So that's one. South Africa, I happened to be there for 4 months last year on sabbatical, and very lucky to witness that election. That was a pivotal election, as we know, 30 years after the end of apartheid, a decade of economic crisis and faltering public services, most crucially, a phenomenon called state capture by Jacob Zuma, who was the president from 2009 to 2018 when he was forced out of office by a remarkable public inquiry initiated by the public protector, who charged the Zuma administration with state capture, massive cronyism and corruption, where they basically cannibalized the state, led to a 4-year public inquiry by the Zondo Commission, a former Supreme Court justice led that, and the Constitutional Court exerted its authority and basically said it filed him for contempt of court for not appearing before the court in this major corruption inquiry, and in 2021 banned him from running for office. So what happened in this election? The polls here, unlike in India where everyone thought the BJP would win, the polls here were remarkably accurate. The ANC dropped to 40% of the total popular vote, which is a crucial threshold psychologically for the ANC and South Africa generally, right? This has been the party of liberation. They drop to 40%, and they have to form a coalition government, which is called, to roll back to the early first post-apartheid government, a government of national unity. 10 parties in it, the 2 dominant players are the ANC and the DA. And we've seen this fractured verdict. And so how do you view this? So important things to take away from this election. They formed a coalition government. The incumbent accepted the verdict. This is a chance to forge a competitive multi-party polity. It creates an opportunity for the ANC to reform itself organizationally, tackle serious challenges. Accountability institutions remained independent and strong, but then there's some worrying signs. Civic participation is in decline. Lowest turnout ever, 58%. India was 66%, its second highest since independence. South Africa fell to 58% from a high of 89, granted in a moment of euphoria in 1994. Many young voters in particular, is the most worrying sign, the so-called born frees, those born after 1994, did not vote. Roughly 2/3 didn't even register to vote. And South Africa's median age is 28, just like India's. And this is really concerning because many in that generation actually look back at the political settlement of 1994 and say that they made a mistake, that Mandela so-called sold out because he championed racial reconciliation and political freedom, but not what they call economic freedom, because South Africa's economy is still highly racialized. There are not major structural reforms. And that's the great threat that I at least perceived when I was there. There's the cronyism and the corruption of elements of the ANC, which are now a chance to regenerate. But this is the socioeconomic challenge, the structural challenges of a highly racialized economy because of the path they took, a very neoliberal policy framework, post-94, particularly under Mbeki. And that's actually what led to Zuma's popularity. Zuma was basically saying that pact is what led South Africa down the wrong road. So that is another worrying sign that in this election, even though he was barred from running, he created a new party which he backed, Mkhonto Sizwe, which is taking from the ANC's militant arm during the anti-apartheid struggle. It won 45% in KwaZulu-Natal, his home state, and 15% nationally. And that's the threat, that if this government does not tackle these serious problems of crime and corruption, most crucially socioeconomic opportunities, that ethno-national autocratic populist politics that Zuma represents, and there are many other parties, could stage that comeback in the next election. I was going to talk about Brazil, but I've already run out of time, but I'm happy to take questions on that. It's a really remarkable case to compare with the US, because Mr. Bolsonaro declares those as a mini Trump. He, on January the 8th, tried to launch a coup d'etat, but he's been barred from running for office. But there, the rule of law and the system, the judiciary, both worked and didn't work because it's highly politicized. There's a sort of element of lawfare in Brazilian democracy, and there's a weaponization of the law. And I can get into more details if you're interested. Thanks.
All right, so we've got in this corner over here that liberal democracy is a matter of, is an article of faith. It's religious dogma. And over there we've got that the window never closes. So I think you should have it.
I'm not sure exactly. What do you mean by have at it? Like, that's a little, that's some kind of violence.
I think it'd be useful to have a bit of a conversation amongst yourselves about, first of all, what you think about each other's reflections. I've got a bunch of questions. I know we want to go to the audience shortly, but I would ask you first to just engage with each other if you want to respond to something that you heard.
Okay, so my reaction is, I mean, I've never believed that democracy survives because people believe in it. I mean, I've just always been really skeptical of that argument. So to me, the idea that people have lost faith, I mean, that's a problem in and of itself, but that's not really why democracy has persisted, in my view, in places like the United States. It's persisted because it's just too darn hard to monopolize political control when resources are spread across such a broad swath of society. And you know, that's what we have to worry about. It's the monopolization by the government of economic resources, not sort of whether or not people believe in democracy. I mean, you know, I think there's a reason, you know, in and of itself why it's, you know, cynicism is probably bad in and of itself, but I don't think that's sort of, the increase in cynicism is itself the cause of democratic decline.
Is this on? Look, first of all, I agree with that, but what I would draw attention to is this question, not of whether a political system can continue either because people like it or because it has inertia, or both. Because I think both are definitely true. And you know, the Roman Republic was never abolished. It technically carried on until 1453, and it still had that name. But that kind of thing aside, I think, especially in Western countries like Canada and America, the question of not simply whether people should be free, but whether or not they are by nature, I think is going to become more and more critical as, I guess, value pluralism continues to multiply. And of course, there are people who we are aware of for various reasons who want to believe, maybe they don't necessarily say that that isn't true, they don't necessarily deny it openly, but there's certainly an attitude whereby there's some portion of the population that is somehow more, that their particular disposition or identity is more important than a common humanity. And I think that if that is allowed to persist, we could still have a democracy, but it would not be recognizably liberal, and it would, I think it would go a long way to undermine any kind of, whether you use the word liberal or not, any kind of doctrine or vision of human freedom. That's my only a small quarrel. Sorry, I have so many microphones.
Well,
So much to say.
I'll just interject here and say I agree with part of what you're saying, because clearly one of the things I said is that liberal democracy does not come naturally. The commitment to liberal democracy most definitely does not come naturally. It is completely contrary to our basic nature, and I think Hobbes told us a little bit about that and what life in the state of nature is. Life in the forest, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And so liberal democracy, or any form of societal arrangement that is, you know, that is concerned with some kind of broad security for everyone and some kind of fair-minded sharing of resources, involves a commitment. I'm really distressed about what Lucan is saying, though, because it sounds like you think that things will just take care of themselves because we've got a system in which there is just such a diversity of interests that nobody could ever monopolize them.
Oh, no. Oh, and that's not what I mean. I mean that we have a fighting chance, but people have to fight. And so what's been really depressing to me is that the powerful have not been using their power. And that, you know, it's the people in the big law firms, the Harvard University. I mean, like, Harvard University was just like capitulating. Columbia University was capitulating. These major law firms, you know, were capitulating. So yes, they had to fight. But my point is that they can fight. Some people just don't have the resources to fight. They can fight. So that's why I think it can happen. And I do think you're beginning to see that happen. So I absolutely don't think it's sort of somehow kind of automatically going to happen. But I think, in certain societies, it's harder or easier to fight. In Russia, in the early 2000s, long before Putin started jailing anybody for anything, the resources were so concentrated that the opposition simply had no money, right? And that's just not the case in the United States. That's my point.
Luke, you want to get in?
Yeah, sure. Is this on? Yeah. So on this issue of, I think beliefs are important, norms are clearly important, but I'm wary of associating them with a particular religion or religion generally. Just think about, if you think about the history of liberalism, it's coterminous in the West with the history of empire and colonialism. And many of those colonial subjects did not need to believe in any particular religion just to say that they were being oppressed, right? So that's the first thing. Second, I think when you also think about this, you also have to historicize it. So to move away from democracy, think about theories of development. For the longest time, one of the classic books, Max Weber, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, that's what led to the emergence of capitalism in Western Europe before China. There are other than contending arguments against that. But then you think about Confucianism and a collectivist ethos that was always seen as something that would hold back East Asia. And then you had Japan, and you had China, and you had South Korea, and you had Taiwan, the most remarkable industrial transformations in terms of their speed in the world. So I think when we think about these things, values, of course, matter, and certain cultural practices, norms, beliefs matter. But to think about them in a totality, I think, is really risky. Because if there's one thing that really matters for liberal democracy, yes, there are these core beliefs about individual rights, minority rights, separation of power, so on. But it's actually, Lucan's first one, about pluralism, maybe by default or maybe by design. But that's the point. I think of the Indian Constitution, which is one of the most remarkable constitutions. It had many elements. It had elements that were group rights and individual rights. It had elements of liberalism and socialism. It had elements of Hindu belief as well. So I think this is the thing that the punchline would be something like, there are many paths to democracy, historically, and there are probably several paths to breakdown as well. And if that's the case, then I think the upshot is you don't have to put all your money on one bet. That if we don't have this, we're doomed, or if we have this, we succeed. And I think that's always going to be the case historically. At different periods, there are different paths in the 3 different generations, the so-called waves of democracy. There are different paths to democracy. There are different reverse paths. We're going to have to figure it out ourselves today.
Michael,
Thank you. Well, again, I'll be very practical. When we look at democracy and how can we make it work, basically we have to make it work for people. And I think one of the ways of making it work now is to make people understand it is not, as you say, self-evident. It is something that needs engagement. It is attacked. It is under threat. But also, I think we need, as political practitioners, people in government need to address inequalities, and we need to make our societies fairer. But also, we need to address complexity. We have been, in particular, in liberal democracies like Germany and Canada, 2 countries I know best, we have been trying to address every ill or every special case by special regulation. We have created very opaque systems. People do not understand the systems anymore. They can't operate in them anymore. We will need to actually slim down, and we need to manage expectation. How much can government, how much can the state do for you, but how much is upon yourself to do?
All right, we're going to go to questions, but Michael wanted to make another observation.
Yeah, it's an observation buried within which is somehow a reply. The observation that was just made about I forget the exact phrase, but a system within which people now struggle to operate, like me trying to remember coding in BASIC for DOS 6.2 or something. Yeah, I was once quite good at it, but no longer. I think if we cast our minds back, I was born in 1982, so I think many of you are much older than I am. I'm still old enough to remember at least the end of the Cold War. And you know, there's a species of liberalism that people refer to as Cold War liberalism that is somehow, depending on who you ask, is different from other sorts. I would just observe very simply, even just based on my own recollection, that the external pressure on the West from an ostensibly hostile regime, a competitor that was purported to offer some kind of fundamentally different political and economic system, you know, I feel that it's almost as though something like that is taking shape again, something like that feeling. Now, I'm a nostalgic sort of person, and looking back, I think this is, you know, in some ways that this isn't necessarily bad. It's good to have something to fight for, and there was you know, the 90s were an exciting time for many people, but there was also a sense in which that's when things began to go wrong. And that you know, some people refer to it as a defensive crouch of liberalism or something, but maybe it actually wasn't. You know, maybe it was actually something more like a time in which it was easier to assert liberal freedoms as a defense against tyranny. It was more obvious, it was clearer what was being fought for, protected, and what was resisted. And, you know, in the absence of that, you know, there's perhaps something akin to a drift. Now, as we feel that taking shape again, I think I'm more inclined to agree with this theory of a fighting chance, of a cause to fight for, and a cause to resist, or an evil cause to resist. You know, that might sound kind of grim or you know, you know, sort of lacking color or something, but I still think that there's, I think that that's the kernel of the fighting chance, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. I think one of the, you know, as an American, I come from America. I just applied for my citizenship 20 years into here. I'm sorry. This is one of the only countries in which the center left kind of owns the flag, right? I mean, am I wrong? Right? And you know, as opposed to the far right, which is in most cases, or the center, I guess, or center right, center left. You know, I think that's a huge leg up in Canada's fight for democracy, because, you know, part of the problem with, you know, part of the reason why I'm oftentimes skeptical that that people's support for democracy is all that important for the success of democracy is that for the most part, people just do not care about process. You know, that's just not something that's easy to rally around. What's easier is around your community. And the problem is most of the time, or a lot of the time when you rally around your community, it's about oppressing someone else or a minority. But we're in a privileged position. I know that's kind of hard to say, and you know, I haven't gone to the grocery store recently, so you know, to see how expensive things are. But you know, I think we're in a privileged position where fighting for the community is fighting for democracy, which is why I think, you know, Canada is. I'm relatively, you know, quite optimistic about liberalism in Canada for that reason.
All right, we're going to go to questions. Obviously, the reason to care is what the stakes are, right? I mean, I would turn to you and say, well, you know, what about all the damage that's being done? What do you say to all the harm that's being done? What do you say to the guy who's now sitting in a prison in El Salvador, who shouldn't be there for all the reasons that we understand? What do you say in your moment of optimism and hopefulness about the rehabilitation of some form of liberal constitutionalism for reasons that have apparently nothing to do with anyone's commitment to that cause? What do you say about the harm already suffered?
Right. I mean, I'm saying my optimism is about the United States. It's certainly not about El Salvador. So I actually do not necessarily feel optimistic about El Salvador. My optimism isn't kind of universal in that sort of the nature of humanity is democratic and, the long arc of history is going to, do whatever. It's about looking at, different cases. And, in some cases it's harder, and in other cases it's easier to monopolize political and economic power. In the United States, it's a bit harder than it is in places like El Salvador or Russia or Belarus. That's my only point.
You, sir. Monty.
Thank you.
Questions?
Listening to all the speeches thus far, I'm just going to offer a few reflections. What about the role of culture within the nation state? Because culture is the liniment. It is theology. It's political publics. It's civics. Because it gives capital, human capital, to coin a phrase by Robert Putnam many years ago. And then I'm thinking of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, when
Sure.
he was alone, isolated, privileged, erudite, who could have stayed away, yet he returned to confront what he termed existential evil. And he was reflecting, parsing the lineaments of our soul. And as we approach the weekend, I'm reflecting on the bastard who got nailed. Humanity trying to rise up, but it does not make what is or what is not. But we are living in what I call anomy. And I am optimistic, but I'm guardedly so. It requires moral courage to stand up, to be a Daniel, to speak up, regardless of what the consequences may be. And I thank the participants, and I thank the organizers.
Thanks, Monty. We've got one to talk about community work.
Okay, this is great. The subject of anomie, I think, is an extremely important one. I'm glad to hear the name Robert Putnam. I think that one of the fundamental challenges of liberalism is that it has taken on, and some argue that it was like this at the beginning. You can find tones of it in people like John Stuart Mill, whereby the process of history is one that effaces what sort of comes before and gradually wears away on what Mill called the despotism of custom and things like that. And you're left with separating individuals, as you say, from community, from deep ties, which perhaps in the 19th century were indeed oppressive, or they were too constrictive, or they were too they had a tendency to dissolve the individual into a group. Now, if I may say, the one weakness of liberalism is that, at least in its current form, is that it does not have a solution to this problem. And that Fukuyama, again, discusses this at the end of his book, The End of History, the part called The Last Man, the part that nobody read. And he says that, well, I read it, but, he says that it's a version of the Buchenfeld dilemma, where he says that all of the institutions and beliefs and communities and so forth that liberalism works within or on top of, or whatever metaphor you like, that it takes them for granted, and it didn't create any of them. And if your vision of what liberalism is meant to do is to sort of emancipate people ever more from institutions, social ties, families, and so forth, as some have argued that it should do, you're left with a kind of doctrine that wears away at the things that institutions and relationships and communities that undergird it. So what should we do about that? Some people have said that there should be a kind of liberalism that is more at ease with these older institutions, that is that embraces I think Timothy Garton Ash said this, embraces a conservative mission of safeguarding the international order, smaller post-national communities, families, you name it, these smaller associations and so forth. But again, I'm going to end on a sort of unhappy note. If if something like that were to take shape, the question would be, would that be liberalism? And another thing I don't have an answer for.
Yeah, well, it wouldn't be liberalism if it was at the behest of the state. That's the whole point. So what you've identified is really the heart of the communitarian critique of liberalism, a kind of politics without persons. But that doesn't mean that liberalism cannot exist alongside community, churches, synagogues, clubs, organizations, Massey College, etc., where that work of community building takes place. The issue is really what's the role of the state in that enterprise, and that is, so the answer is it wouldn't be liberalism if the state is in the business of doing those things. But let's just go to another question. Bernie Lucht was next, and then you at the back. Okay, Bernie, go ahead.
I think, don't you need a microphone? They need microphones there.
I've been talking loud enough.
No, it's recorded. It's recorded.
Okay, well,
So,
someone can take mine.
oh, sorry, thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you. I want to start by thanking Peter and all the members of the panel for the fantastic presentation this morning. I want to tell you about an interview I heard on the CBC last week. And as an aside, let me tell you how glad I am that there is at least a reasonable chance that the CBC will not be defunded after the next election. The interview was with a young woman who runs an organization in Toronto dedicated to getting out the vote of young people. And by young people, she was referring to people between the ages of 18 and 29. And she said something that really shocked me. She was asked why people weren't voting. Was it that they didn't care or they felt detached from the political institutions? And she said, no, it's not that at all. She said most of them don't even know there's an election going on. So I would ask the panel if there could be some comment on what this is all about.
So I'll take a stab at that. So again, you're talking about in Canada, presumably, right? So I think one thing that happens in established democracies, which are now suffering, these new challenges and threats, is that it's the thing, we've taken things for granted. And you're young, you're in your 20s. I remember being in my 20s. I voted, but there's a lot going on in your life, and many of my friends didn't vote. And some of us did, and we were seen as keeners and so on. And then as you grow older, you take on some of those more civic responsibilities, perhaps. I think in the countries that I've studied more, I grew up here, I think particularly during transitions democracy, it's very striking when people realize like they've struggled for a democracy and now they have one, and there's a lot at stake. So that's when you can see a rising in turnout. South Africa, first election, 89%. In the Brazilian election of 2022, 79% of Brazilians voted. That's the second point. When things are at stake, that was a highly competitive election. It's the last time I saw a figure that close. It's 50.9 to 40.1 for Mr. Lula over Bolsonaro. Was the Quebec referendum in 1995, right? That mobilizes people. Something's at stake. I have a feeling in this election we're about to see now, it'll be interesting to see what happens to the youth vote. I have a lot of conversations with a group in Montreal called Apathy is Boring. It's a terrific title. It's to get out young Canadians to vote. And I think because of the stakes of this election, I hope we're going to see more. But there's more that can be done. I mean, I'm at TMU. One of my colleagues is John Beebe. He's leader of the Canadian Vote Coalition. And one of the things that he has innovated, done remarkably well, is to really encourage campus-based voting. So there's innovations that can take place as well. You kind of meet up, as editors often say, let's meet the readers where they are. I think as our public institutions, let's meet youth where they are. Let's make it easier for them to vote. Let's create more incentives for the vote. And once you get that culture, that's one of the things that comes through studies. If you vote in your first election, you're more likely to keep voting. So that, there's a path dependence here. And I think, let's see what happens in this election here.
Okay, let time for 2 quick questions because we need to break. We're going to resume the next panel at 11:30. No, it's Mr. Jones, right? No, it's not Mr. Jones. Oh, right. Okay, of course.
I teach across the road at Trinity.
Yep.
I guess this is sort of a riff on what Michael Bonner said. Harold Macmillan once said if people want a sense of purpose, they should get it from their archbishops. And I guess it was touching on a feature of liberal democracy. It leads people to find their own sense of purpose. But I wonder if that's enough. I mean, it seems to me that at least through its heroic period, most of the 20th century, liberal democracy had that sense of purpose in its opposition to totalitarianisms of various sorts. And what's striking about the 1989 Fukuyama optimism is how thin a sense of human nature it rested on. I thought we'd all be sufficiently happy just trading with one another around the globe. We'd all get rich and fat and happy. And it sort of ignored these deeper loyalties of ethnicity and religion and so on that politics doesn't really speak to that much unless it's yoked to them. And now it is yoked to them, and we have this resurgence of competing ideologies. Maybe finding what grounds our opposition to that will be what restores a sense of purpose to liberalism. I'd be curious to know what the panelists think.
Well, I think that's right. I think it's 95% right. The 5% that isn't right is that at the end of Fukuyama's book, he predicts that we would arrive at a point very much like the one we are now at, in which
That's the part nobody read.
right, that people would struggle against a comfortable system, and that a particular vision of liberalism would have a tendency to uproot itself from those institutions. I agree strongly with the idea of a mission, of a purpose to Cold War liberalism. I think that is something that was quite obvious at the time. I think I didn't, I only saw 7 years of it, but and I was quite young, but it was still very, very clear at the time. And there were hangovers of it with, for instance, the struggle against the apartheid, even very basic things like the acid rain treaties, international cooperation and so forth. One other observation, it was no matter what the communitarian critiques of liberalism may say, and some of them in recent days have been quite vehement, some sort of bordering on the unhinged, but they often lose sight of the fact that Cold War liberalism was the moment at which liberalism was most comfortable with community, church, family, bowling societies, the Moose Club or the Elks, or whatever. And it's I was reading a book. I can't remember what it was recently, but this fellow was inveighing against liberalism, immediately after the Second World War, and I found myself wondering what he was talking about, because it was that period during which the associational life was at its peak in the 20th century, certainly in America and Canada, and one wonders whether that could be recreated. However, there's also a sense in which the claims that Fukuyama and others and many committed liberals have made for liberalism are too exaggerated, and that they should be more circumspect. And the reason I say this is that if you think about, I'll take these in reverse chronological order, the Polish solidarity movement that many say was the, I'm not sure what the right metaphor is, it was the impetus that broke up the Soviet Union, which led to free elections in the Eastern Bloc. It was that movement with Lech Walesa and the Archbishop of Krakow and then Pope that opened the door to liberalism, not the other way around. Further back, civil rights. I mean, I'm not a Protestant. I'm not even a Roman Catholic, but reading Martin Luther King, they are works of theology, and he has supplied a theological basis to constitutional principles. Further back, the struggle against slavery, which ostensibly liberal empires were comfortable with. You read the correspondence between Wilberforce and Charles Wesley, or one of the Wesley brothers. I forget, always confusing. This is every single word is some sort of just deeply imbued in these theological ideas. Again, supplying a theological basis to assumptions of liberalism. These things have a way of asserting themselves at the right moment. Perhaps it will happen again. I don't know.
If I may just add an optimistic note to that, we value things more when they're threatened. And I think this may be the moment where liberalism is finding its purpose again, which it may have lost. But because it is so obviously threatened, we may have that moment in time where we can find the purpose again and act upon it.
Unfortunately, we really are out of time. I would like to keep going, but that's going to put us off quite a bit. We were supposed to start the next panel in 4 minutes from now, but you need time to perhaps take a break, grab a coffee, use the facilities. So with that, I'm going to apologize for cutting us short and thank this amazing panel.